have another ILLIT video, Lucky Girl Syndrome official music video. If you're new, make sure you subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have, and make sure you go check out my first ILLIT video, Magnetic, super good song. Really like this group, so let's check out this video.
완벽한 날씨 딱 맞는 playlist 오늘의 selfie I say I'm lucky 세상은 chocolate 삼키자 so sweet 긍정의 짙기 lucky girl syndrome I don't need 어떤 golden ticket도 All I need 내 자신을 믿는다 Finally 다 이루어질 거야 내 주문을 외워 Yeah, love, yeah, I'm a lucky girl. Yeah, you're a lucky girl. Yeah, you're so lucky. Love, 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 love. 주문을 걸어 love. 난 정말 lucky girl. 넌 정말 lucky girl, 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 girl. Take out our breakfast. 선택은 best choice. 도착한 cruise line.
I like that beat breakdown, like dun 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 dun. I like that. It's a really fun group. I really like ILLIT. Just like Magnetic, really fun song. This feels like a really fun song too. So I mean, so far this is 10 out of 10 for me so far.
삼키자 so sweet 긍정의 짙기 lucky girl syndrome I don't need 어떤 golden ticket도 All I need 내 자신을 믿는다 Finally 다 이루어질 거야 내 주문을 외워 Yeah love yeah I'm a lucky girl Yeah you're a lucky girl Yeah you're so lucky
I guess it's gonna be a new dance for everybody to learn.
설렘이 계속 차오르는 걸 I believe 이뤄져 믿는 대로 Finally 넌 이유를 아니 Together you and me Yeah love, yeah I'm a lucky girl Yeah you're a lucky girl Yeah we're so lucky love, 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 love 주문을 걸어 love 넌 정말 lucky girl 넌 정말 lucky girl, 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 girl Oh my girl, 주문을 걸어 say That's my girl, lucky girl syndrome Oh my girl, 주문을 걸어 say That's my girl, lucky girl syndrome Yeah, my lucky girl
Lucky Girl Syndrome. Super real me? Oh, that's the name of the album coming out. Alright. ILLIT, Lucky Girl Syndrome, Super Real Me. I don't know if that's like a name of an album that's coming out or something. Somebody let me know in the comment section. Super good, just like first song, Magnetic, 10 out of 10. This song's really good. I give this 10 out of 10 as well. So if you're new and you like this song and you like my reactions, go ahead and subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have. And I'll see you guys in the next reaction.